Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Price Formation Enhancements Stakeholder Meeting. Today, we will be discussing the discussion paper stakeholder recommendation. My name is Brenna Marquez. On behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs, we welcome you to this meeting. Today, we will be starting off with a few meeting reminders as this call is being recorded for informational and conveniences purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. During the call, if you do experience any technical issues, feel free to submit them over the chat, and then we'll be able to help you. Our event producer is Ahmed, and I will be helping monitor any chat questions and route them over to the team. As well, we do have a few folks on this call that will be introducing them shortly. As well, for the discussion paper, we'll be reviewing and sending that link right now in reference to this meeting. And then also, we'll go ahead and review the next instructions for raising a hand to ask a question. So most of the individuals here on the call are logged in through the WebEx. You'll be using the raise hand icon located above the chat window. This will allow us to have a queue of individuals who would like to ask a question or comment. We do ask that you follow whether James has any moments to review any questions during his specific slides. As well, we do encourage not to repeat any comments that were previously mentioned so we can make sure all questions that are asked during the call are answered. As a reminder, state your full name and affiliation before stating a comment, and also those submitted through chat. As a reminder, we do have ISO stakeholder policy initiative process that we wanted to give you guys all a overview. We are currently working on the proposal development of the price formation enhancements. We will have James kind of cover exactly where we stand within posting the discussion paper, but other than that, we are currently in the beginning part of the proposal development. Next, I'll go ahead and introduce James. Feel free to provide your title, and we do also have Danny Johnson and Juan. He'll be here to assist. But go ahead, James. You can go ahead.
Everyone, I think Juan's going to kick us off for the first two slides.
I appreciate that, James. Yeah, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So welcome, everybody. The long-anticipated return to this. Happy to have you guys here. As James said, he's going to do the lion's share here today, and I wanted to outline kind of that move in phases. So just a general stakeholder process overview. Juan Petrago from Stakeholder Engagement, right? For those of you who have been engaged, I had been facilitating those prior working groups, and those are characterized by phase one in this blue box that you're seeing here. So to date, we've had 18 different working group meetings since August 2023 and onwards, tackling a variety of different topics within the price formation area, and that also kind of folded in the bidding above the soft offer cap. And within those, we've identified the problem statements. We spent some time establishing those guiding principles, especially at the forefront of this conversation. And then we went through and kind of prioritized the issues, those issue statements or challenge areas or areas of opportunity that have been identified. And I think this is a very key moment, and you'll see the arrow over into the salmon box of phase two. And really that arrow is kind of symbolic of my handing this off to James, where we begin phase two and that iterative design process. I wanted to highlight that we are still asking for that very active stakeholder engagement that we had in the working group phases as well, because we're going to be diving into detailed proposals and associated analysis. So we're really basing this off of that collaborative approach that we had similar to the EDAM stakeholder process, where we continuously integrated that feedback as we were actually developing those proposals and solutions. So if we could just really quickly go to the next slide. All right, so this is the transition to phase two. If you have read the paper, you'll see that we have broken it into different tracks, 2 different tracks to be specific. We have the market power mitigation and scarcity pricing track. We're going to be addressing this as a single integrated policy. This iterative process, which begins today, is going to begin the straw proposal development, targeting a straw proposal in May of 2025. So we're going to let James will go into more detail on this. But again, we really want to make sure that we're providing an avenue for you, the stakeholder community, to share your thoughts, perspectives, and have those influence and shape that final straw proposal. On a separate track, we have fast start pricing, something that in the initial phase of the working groups, we had basically asked for your feedback in scoping and analysis for fast start pricing so that we could kind of continue that conversation. So that's going to be addressed in a separate but parallel process. We want to keep momentum moving here. And those working groups are beginning right now with an iterative proposal development on fast start pricing expected in 2025. So I'm not going to read all of the process notes here for you, but in essence, we are leveraging the working group style for solutions development, for policy design. We want to make sure we're reflecting the things that are of high priority and to this community in essence. And it also is going to allow us with that iterative approach to make sure that the timelines are adjustable. Things can rise up and we can respond to them. So I want to take a moment to just say thank you to all of you for the last year of heavy engagement here. We've had some very good conversations that are going to continue. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to James to kind of kick us off into phase 2. So James, all yours.
Thank you, Juan. Let's go to the next slide. Welcome, everyone. So yeah, if you're here to discuss the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative, you're in the right place. This initiative focuses on improving our market design to better serve the needs of our growing Western markets. So as you can see on this slide, price formation enhancements encompass 3 key areas: scarcity pricing, market power mitigation, and fast start pricing. These enhancements aim to improve the accuracy of our market clearing prices, provide better market price signals, and enhance incentives for resources to perform. So let's briefly touch on each of these, and we'll get into each of them in more detail in the later slides. First, scarcity pricing. So scarcity pricing has come into focus following recent grid emergencies during the summer of 2020, summer of 2022 and 2023, as well as winter of 2024, and the ever-tightening supply conditions affecting the entire Western grid. This mechanism helps to maintain grid reliability by sending price signals that encourage increased generation or reduce demand during tight supply conditions. It is the general view of the working group that enhancements in these areas could help the market become a more effective steward of reliable outcomes. So market power mitigation, particularly scope for this initiative is BAA level market power mitigation. This mechanism is critical to ensure fair and competitive market pricing when BAs become price separated from the rest of the market. A growing number of entities participating in our markets call into question the appropriateness of tests that were designed when the Western EIM had only a handful of entities. Finally, fast start pricing. Fast start pricing incorporates the commitment costs of fast start resources into market clearing prices. There are perspectives across the market footprint that introducing fast start pricing would result in more accurate and fair energy market compensation, especially during peak periods where the market is more reliant on fast start resources to meet demand, but the costs of using those resources are not always fully covered by market payments. So these 3 enhancements are vital to increase our market efficiency and reliability, and will ensure that our market prices best reflect real-time grid conditions by implementing more accurate, consistent, and transparent pricing mechanisms across all balancing areas. So as we move forward with this initiative, we look forward to collaborating closely with stakeholders to develop and refine these enhancements to meet the evolving needs of our Western markets. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to turn our attention to scarcity pricing. After this subset of slides on scarcity pricing, we'll stop for feedback and questions. So first, what exactly is scarcity pricing? As you can see on the slide, scarcity pricing is a market mechanism that determines market prices when there is insufficient supply to meet demand. When there is insufficient supply to meet demand, the marginal cost of supply cannot be determined in the market clearing price. So therefore, markets use scarcity pricing mechanisms to set prices that reflect the value of electricity rather than the cost, scaled based on the severity of the shortage. So you can review the more detailed discussions of these concepts, including an example and discussions of things like slack variables in the working group materials that we've posted in the past. For now, this is just a simple overview. The primary goal of scarcity pricing is to help maintain grid reliability. It does this by sending price signals that encourage two critical responses during scarce conditions. First, increased generation. So when prices rise due to scarcity, it incentivizes suppliers to both increase their market offers if possible, and also for resources to stay online and produce. Second, it encourages reduced demand. Higher prices encourage all forms of demand to reduce their grid electricity consumption, including consumers with flexible loads, exports out of the system, pumps that are pumping, batteries that are charging, etc. Anything that forms a demand on the system, higher prices encourage less of that to happen, which is exactly what you would want during tight system conditions. And these responses are intended to prevent more severe emergency actions like load shedding. It's important to note that scarcity pricing is not just about higher prices during extreme events. It's a sophisticated mechanism that reflects the true value of electricity in real time, especially when the system is under stress. So improving scarcity pricing can lead to more efficient market outcomes and enhance overall grid reliability. Next slide, please. So now let's dive deeper into how scarcity pricing works in practice. This slide illustrates how scarcity pricing is typically effectuated through what the industry calls reserve shortage pricing. And here's the basic logical flow. First, on the left-hand side, starts with the basic general principle that more supply reserves lead to a more reliable grid. In fact, if we had a superabundance of supply available to the market at all times, we wouldn't be having this conversation about scarcity pricing. However, as available reserves decrease, there is a corresponding increase in the loss of load expectations. In other words, the risk of not being able to meet all demand goes up as our reserves go down. This increased risk translates directly into a higher willingness to pay for additional reserves because of the value these reserves have in maintaining system reliability. Finally, and here's where it gets interesting, the energy price in our market reflects not just the cost of energy production, but also the opportunity cost of not providing reserves at the scarcity price. This happens because the market co-optimizes energy and reserves. So to be clear, even though this mechanism is called reserve shortage pricing, it impacts both reserve and energy market prices through co-optimization. In essence, as reserves become more scarce, their value increases, which in turn drives up the overall energy price. This mechanism ensures that our market prices accurately reflect the true system conditions, including the scarcity of reserves. So scarcity pricing is a dynamic pricing system that responds to real-time grid conditions and helps to maintain reliability by sending appropriate price signals to market participants. Next slide, please. This slide reviews the current scarcity pricing mechanisms in place in the CAISO markets today. As you can see, there are several mechanisms that apply to different parts of our market footprint. First, on the left, for the CAISO Balancing Authority area only, there is the Scarcity Reserve Demand Curve, or SRDC. This mechanism is designed to raise ancillary service prices during reserve shortages and energy prices through co-optimization, as we talked about on the previous slide, and thereby reflecting the increased value of ancillary services and energy when they're scarce. Next, we have mechanisms that apply to all WEAN participants, including the CAISO. These are, first, the Flexible Ramping Product, or FRP, demand curve. This demand curve helps price the scarcity of ramping capability in our real-time market. Second, our power balance constraint violations. When the market can't balance supply and demand, This mechanism allows prices to rise to reflect that scarcity. Finally, FERC Order 831, bidding above the soft offer cap, which I had actually meant to take this box out. So I apologize for that because it's not really scarcity pricing the way we've defined it in the previous slides, but because it falls under the category of generally pricing and bidding under extreme conditions, it sometimes gets lumped in under scarcity pricing. So the basic concept is that this allows resources to bid above the $1,000 soft offer cap under certain conditions. Lastly, for our future EDAM participants, we will have the imbalance reserve demand curve, which, similar in function to the FRP demand curve, prices the scarcity of imbalance reserves in our day-ahead market. So it's important to note that while these mechanisms provide a good foundation for scarcity pricing in our markets, that this initiative considers potential enhancements to ensure that they accurately reflect scarcity conditions across our entire market footprint and across all market intervals. Next slide, please. So as we consider enhancing our scarcity pricing mechanisms, it's important to understand the key drivers that are pushing us towards reform. This slide outlines the 4 main problem statements we identified through the working group. First, we have inconsistent ancillary service procurement. The real-time market only procures incremental ancillary services for the CAISO BAA rather than fully reoptimizing them. Additionally, the market does not reoptimize ancillary services in the 5-minute RTD market. These limitations can lead to less efficient scarcity pricing outcomes and procurement because it can disconnect the market from the logic that we described on slide 6. Second, the working group identified potentially outdated penalty prices. Currently, our pricing run penalty prices are tied to the market bid cap, which may not accurately reflect the true reliability value during scarcity events. There's also concern that these prices may be too low to provide effective incentives. Third, the working group identified potential disconnects between market prices and grid conditions during emergencies. The current market design may not adequately reflect the severity of emergency conditions in market prices. This can lead to situations where prices don't align with the actual scarcity level indicated by emergency operator actions. Also, depending on the nature of the emergency action, it can apply downward or upward pressure on prices, which creates potentially misrepresentative price signals in real time. Finally, we have insufficient scarcity signals. The scarcity reserve demand curve and power balance constraint violations in the market only trigger during actual shortages, which can result in price spikes that are volatile and unpredictable. There are insufficient mechanisms in the market for prices to rise gradually as we approach scarcity conditions. This limits market participants' ability to respond proactively to emerging scarcity conditions to trigger a response that would alleviate the shortage before it happens. So collectively, these issues point to the need for reform in our scarcity pricing mechanisms. And by addressing these problems, we aim to improve market efficiency, enhance reliability, and provide more accurate price signals that reflect real-time grid conditions. The next and final slide in this subject. Next slide, please. So, actually, sorry, second to last. So to review the primary objectives of scarcity pricing reform, the 3 main goals are as follows. First, to improve market signals during tight supply conditions. Prices need to accurately reflect the true state of the grid, especially when supply is scarce. Second, to incentivize resource performance and demand reduction. Sending the right price signals will encourage generators to increase their output and consumers to reduce demand when it's most needed. Third, to align prices with real-time grid conditions across the entire Western energy imbalance market. This is crucial for maintaining consistent, efficient, and fair pricing outcomes across the expanding market footprint. However, the working group recognizes that achieving these goals is not without challenges, and this slide identifies 2 significant hurdles. First, we need to address discrepancies in how scarcity pricing applies across different balancing authorities in the markets. As our market expands, harmonizing these approaches will be complicated, but necessary to prevent inconsistencies across the footprint. Second, we need to identify a consensus-driven method to scale and anchor penalty prices. Determining the right approach that stakeholders can agree on will require careful consideration and extensive discussion. So these challenges underscore the complexity of our task, but by working collaboratively with our stakeholders, we believe we can develop effective solutions that meet our goals and enhance our market's performance during scarcity conditions. Next slide, please. Final slide before we pause. We greatly value the input from our stakeholders, and I'd like to share some key points from the feedback we received on scarcity pricing through the working group comments. So this slide represents just a high-level summary of the feedback we received. The actual comments from our stakeholders were much more diverse and detailed, and the paper does provide a pretty good summary if you're interested in more detail. So first, stakeholders provided detailed feedback on the specific problem statements we identified on the previous slide, and their input helps us to ensure that we're addressing the most pressing issues in our market design. Second, stakeholders brought to our attention additional issues that we should explore, which demonstrates the value of our collaborative process and allows us to collectively uncover and address concerns that may not have been initially identified. Third, we received input on the prioritization of scarcity pricing issues. This helped us focus our efforts and resources on the areas that will have the most significant impact on our market's performance. And finally, stakeholders requested additional analyses to support our decision-making process collectively, which shows a commitment from stakeholders and the ISO to a data-driven policy development process, which we fully support. So now's a good time to pause, see if there's any questions or feedback on scarcity pricing.
So for those who are on the phone, feel free to press *3, but if those on the WebEx, go ahead and add yourself on the queue by raising the hand. And we do have about 82 attendees, so I don't see any on the chat, and also a few people. Oh, there we have Dan Williams. Let's go ahead and take him. Please introduce yourself, Dan, if you can.
Hey, James, Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. First, just a great overview so far. It has been a long time that we've been working on this, and it's nice to kind of get the recap. But that sense of having been working on it for 2 years does draw in kind of a question when looking at the timeline of whether you've had any thoughts about in some of the early working group meetings, kind of just revisiting some of the grounding for potential solutions, potential drivers. And I'm just was thinking when Juan was kind of setting up the timeline for, straw proposal, that potential implementation does get out there a little ways, and the ISO grid is changing very quickly. Markets are coming online very quickly. And a lot of that is kind of changing the landscape that's going to be there when these solutions are implemented. So kind of a broad thought / question, but do you see any need for thinking about these maybe differently with, I don't know, 26, 27 implementation versus 22, 23 when we were kind of first starting to dig into everything?
Great question. So I'll be brief only because we can focus more on timeline-related questions in more detail near the end. But I think I have sort of two different sets of feedback on the timeline for scarcity pricing. First is that because of the process that we're undertaking, where the process is more collaborative, more back and forth, more working group style, it's a newer process to the ISO, and therefore it's harder to anticipate when that process is sufficient, it has gone through sufficient time to conclude and move towards getting proposals to the board. And therefore, the timeline is quite conservative in terms of how much time may be needed, depending on how contentious these topics and complicated these topics get, in which case, if we're able to come together as a stakeholder community quicker than what's outlined in the timeline, we would certainly welcome that and hope for that to happen. So the timeline is quite conservative for that reason. Second is that we plan to, what we plan to do as of now, subject to your feedback and to all stakeholder feedback, is to provide a detailed sort of working group agenda over the next, let's say, 6 to 9 months, in which we will try to have clearly delineated dates and topics for each agenda topic, just as you're saying, to try to dive back into these issues so that stakeholders will have ample time to prepare for those discussions by rereading or re-listening to some of the old conversations, talking with us privately if that's warranted, or even to prepare their own perspectives or presentations in those meetings would be extremely valuable. So we hope that by providing that more detailed timeline can sort of get the ball rolling on getting people prepared to participate as efficiently as possible, and therefore sort of try to shrink our timeline down a little bit. Let me know if you have any feedback to that.
Hey, James, he did add a comment on the chat, if you can see that.
Okay, I can, and thank you. So he's confirming it makes sense on the agenda and scope and looking forward to it. I appreciate that, Dan. Any other questions or feedback? And I should mention, we will get more into the specific scope and timeline of each of these topics near the end. And so these sets of slides are just to provide sort of a summary of what happened during the working group, very high level summary of what happened during the working group, as sort of a refresher on these topics. No other hands?
No more hands.
Okay, let's move to the next slide and the next topic. So now we're going to overview BA level market power mitigation. BA level market power mitigation is designed to prevent the exercise of structural market power when a balancing authority area becomes price separated or import constrained from the CAISO BA. In essence, BA level market power mitigation helps ensure that even when a BA is isolated due to transmission constraints, that prices within that BA remain competitive. And this mechanism is part of the existing energy imbalance market in real time and the future EDAM. The primary purpose of BA level mitigation generally is to protect third-party transmission customers who rely on the Western EIN for imbalanced energy service. So this group includes smaller load-serving entities, which are those we typically connect mitigation with, assuring price competitiveness for loads. But it also protects independent generators and renewable generators, among others, who also benefit from competitive pricing when procuring imbalanced energy in the real-time market to cover their day-ahead position. So it's important to understand that most entities in the Western EIM must file for market-based rate authority to transact in the market, or to transact with bids in the market. Our market's automated market power mitigation historically has formed a critical part of this basis for FERC to grant that authority. So these are all things that we discussed within the working groups when we went through some of the history of this market power mitigation method and why it was needed. So as we consider enhancements to this mechanism, we're focused on ensuring that it remains effective as we've greatly expanded the number of participants in the Western EIM since this method was introduced back in 2016. Let's move to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this slide dives into what's called the Dynamic Competitive Path Assessment, or DCPA, which is the CAISO jargon term for the BA level market power mitigation test. It's a key component here to understand. So hopefully this flowchart makes it as simple as possible. Starting from the left, the DCPA process is triggered when a BAA becomes price separated, either individually or with other BAs from the CAISO, assessed by looking at the BA's power balance constraint shadow price relative to the CAISO's. Once triggered, the DCPA assesses the competitiveness of internal generation within the affected BAs individually to determine whether market power mitigation might be necessary. If the DCPA identifies competitive conditions, then no mitigation is applied. The market is then deemed to be functioning competitively despite the price separation. However, if the DCPA does not find competitive conditions, it then examines the associated supply bids. Specifically, it's looking for bids that exceed both the resource's default energy bid and the competitive locational marginal price, which is essentially the margin or LMP subtracting the uncompetitive portion of the transmission congestion. These bids are then mitigated to the higher of these two prices to ensure prices remain at levels expected under sufficient competition. If bids are at or below either the DEB or the competitive LMP, no mitigation is applied. So hopefully that flowchart makes it as clear as possible how the BA level dynamic competitive path assessment works. Now, a key point to remember in the lower left is that this process applies specifically to areas outside the CAISO. The CAISO BA is currently assumed in the test to be structurally competitive and is not subject to this particular mitigation process, either in the WEAM or in the future EDAM at this time. Next slide, please. So the working group identified several key problem statements that drive our MPM enhancement efforts. Overall, on the bottom of the slide, our top priority is to ensure competitive pricing in the market, while at the same time refining our mitigation mechanisms for WEAM and EDAM BAs. To address this, the working group considered these three main ideas. First, to look into a grouping approach to BA level mitigation. This is in response to concerns that our current method may be overestimating structural market power issues by testing individual BAs without considering potential competitive supply on an unconstrained path from a neighbor. By considering groups of BAs together, the market may be able to more accurately assess the true competitive landscape in the market. Second, to apply consistent mitigation across all BAs, including the CAISO, during price separation events. So as I mentioned on the last slide, the CAISO BA is excluded from the BA level dynamic competitive path assessment, and its exclusion may lead to under mitigation in some scenarios, and we want to ensure a level playing field across the entire market footprint. Finally, the third, to consider an impact test. An impact test would allow the market to mitigate bids only if the change in locational marginal price exceeds a defined threshold. This approach may help address concerns about frequent mitigation during off-peak hours when prices are already low. Next slide, please. This is the final slide before I'll pause for feedback and questions. We received valuable feedback from the working group regarding BA level market power mitigation, and I just want to briefly highlight some key points. First, there was broad support from the working group to explore the BA grouping concept. Stakeholders seem to see potential in this approach to improve the accuracy of our market power assessments. However, They also emphasized the need for more technical details and examples to fully understand how this concept would work in practice. Second, while there's interest in the grouping concept, stakeholders expressed concerns about the potential complexity of such a design and stressed the importance of making sure the benefits of this approach outweigh the added complexity. Third, the working group supported exploring the application of BA level, exploring the application of BA level market power mitigation to the CAISO BA, but are hoping to see analysis how including CAISO in this process might impact the market and whether including CAISO in this process is necessary at all. Lastly, an interesting point raised by stakeholders was that mitigation often occurs during off-peak hours when cheap renewable energy is prevalent. This observation led to questions in the working group about the appropriateness of our current mitigation triggers and whether they're aligned with actual market power concerns, and led to some of the discussion about and support for a potential impact test for market power mitigation for the VA level. So I'll pause there to see if there's any feedback or questions on market power mitigation.
James, I don't see any questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just acknowledge Sybil from PGP's comment in the chat about and I appreciate your comment, Sybil. Okay, so let's move on to an overview of fast start pricing. So again, there'll be a few slides on fast start pricing and what happened very high level in the phase 1 of the working groups on fast start pricing, and we'll pause for questions at the end. So first, what is fast start pricing? If you need a refresher, fast start pricing is a market mechanism that's designed to incorporate the commitment costs of fast start resources into market clearing prices directly. Fast start resources are units that are capable of starting quickly and generating within a short time window, typically within 15 to 60 minutes. So if I had the slide back in the upper right, I would have said within 15 to 60 minutes, because there are certainly plenty of resources that can start under the 15 minutes. So it's not just 15 to 60 minutes, it's really 0 to 60 minutes. And that definition of fast start resource varies across markets. So SPP defines a fast start resource as starting in 15 minutes. ISO New England and New York ISO define it as starting within 30 minutes. PJM and MISO define it as starting within 60 minutes. So it varies across the markets. Fast start pricing, the core idea behind fast start pricing is to recognize that these fast start resources can serve as the marginal resource used to meet the next increment of energy or operating reserve demand. However, due to their output levels, they're often ineligible to set the LMP under the current market design. And fast start pricing addresses this by relaxing minimum output constraints of fast start resources in the pricing run, which allows fast start resources to be treated as dispatchable across their entire capacity range for pricing purposes, and also includes commitment costs in those pricing calculations. Next slide, please. So as part of the working group effort, CAISO conducted an analysis to evaluate the potential market impact of fast start pricing. Stakeholders requested this information to better understand the potential impact so as to better inform their decision-making before discussing potential designs. This analysis was conducted in 2 stages. In stage 1 focused on the California ISO BA only, and used historical bid data and some simplifying assumptions to get a feel for what potential fast start pricing impacts might look like, and also to provide stakeholders an opportunity before the CAISO went too far in its analysis to review the types of metrics we were looking at and provide some feedback so that when we moved into stage 2, which incorporated all WEAN entities, that the CAISO would know what metrics were of most interest to stakeholders. So in these red boxes, there's a few components to discuss of this analysis, just at a high level. In stage 2 of the analysis, there were 12 sensitivity scenarios that were explored that varied based on these variables. First, there were different amortization methods included. Amortization refers to the concept of how the market includes commitment costs into prices. And so the 3 that we looked at were a constant adder approach, an adjusted constant adder approach, and the minimum average cost approach. The sensitivity scenarios differed based on time thresholds in which we looked at both the impact of defining a fast start resource as a 30-minute start or a 60-minute start. And there were different market configurations looked at. And to be clear, in the paper makes this clear, these market configurations are not, are done for analysis purposes only. And so one of those configurations was to look at the BA level to get a sense of if there were no constraints between balancing authorities and one generator can set the price for the entire footprint, what the market impact might look like. I'm sorry, that describes the system-wide pricing. The BA level pricing is that only resources within the BA can set the BA price. There were key components analyzed, which include resource characteristics. So there are a lot of sample statistics about the types of resources by area that might be defined as fast start, both in terms of regional, like where they're located, also what supply type they are, what fuel type. There was discussion about historical bid cost recovery data and how those vary over markets and over regions, and also unit commitment patterns. And so that leads us into some of the unique considerations for the CAISO that were explored in this analysis, which is first that in the Western EIM, fast start pricing would apply only to fast start resources that are economically committed by the market and not base scheduled in the WEAN. And so the analysis was able to find which resources were base scheduled at what times, and so as to not misattribute the potential impact of fast start pricing in the real-time market to resources that were self-committed through base schedules. Second, the analysis considered multi-stage generator transitions, which is a unique aspect of the CAISO market, and essentially decided that a MSG transition that was applicable within the fast start timing that we're talking about, 30 or 60 minutes, was eligible to receive fast start pricing treatment. And finally, minimum online constraints are present in the real-time market, in which sometimes certain reliability constraints cause the commitment of certain fast start resources that are not necessarily economic without those constraints, and therefore are not present within the fast start pricing results. Next slide, please. So here's a high-level summary of some of the key findings. The overall impact as identified by the analysis was generally moderate price impacts, but with pretty wide variations depending on the specific design elements and generation mix of the areas we're looking at. So a couple of points to highlight here in terms of price changes. There was wide variety in price changes by area, and were generally low due to the focus on real-time supply changes from base or day-ahead schedules, as mentioned on the previous slide. And they ranged anywhere from no impact at all to $8.70 per megawatt hour in the real-time market. And these figures are monthly averages by balancing areas. Second, there's an obvious seasonal trend where there are higher increases to fast start pricing during summer months, which makes sense because with more load, there's more need for fast start resources to come online to meet the load. Third, there are time of day impacts. Primarily, you'll see fast start pricing impacts during the morning and evening peak hours, which makes perfect sense because when you're in peaking situations, you may need fast start resources to be committed to help meet those peaks. Finally, there's a wide range of frequency of the intervals depending on the method and definition of fast start resource, anywhere between 75% to 97% of intervals with no pricing impact, or on the flip side, 3 to 25% of real-time market intervals with some sort of impact of fast start pricing compared to the status quo. In terms of regional variations, the largest increases tended to happen in Southwest balancing areas and within the CAISO, and the smallest increases tended to happen in Pacific Northwest balancing areas, mostly due to the types of resources that are present in those areas, where the discussion paper notes and the analysis notes that fast start gas resources are the most likely resources to have a large impact on fast start pricing, and just based on where those resources are located will make a big difference in what price impacts to expect. Finally, some key influencing factors that we should think about as we move to the next phase. Resource qualification criteria, which is the difference between 30 or 60-minute startup definition, was the most significant factor of the sensitivity scenarios that we looked at to determine the ultimate market impact. And so to define what fast start resource means in our market is not a trivial thing, as it will have the largest impact on the eventual market prices. Second, the amortization method for commitment costs also varies, or will vary the impact, and that's discussed in more detail in the analysis, as well as regional differences in the generation mix. As I mentioned, where are the fast start gas resources are located tend to have the biggest impact in those areas on the prevailing LMPs. Next slide, please. Finally, before I pause for comments or questions, we heard a diverse range of perspectives from our stakeholders regarding the potential implementation of fast start pricing in our market. Some stakeholders see the value of fast start pricing and advocate for its continued prioritization and discussion in these working groups. They see it as an important tool for improving price formation and market efficiency. Other stakeholders do not see the value of fast start pricing. So many stakeholders recognize what the analysis showed, which is that the impacts can vary significantly depending on the specific design choices we make. So there's desire for more detailed analysis on how fast start pricing might affect uplift payments and bid cost recovery payments. The stakeholders want to ensure that any potential benefits outweigh the added complexity to our market design. Finally, we received requests for more information about how fast start pricing would interact with other key market elements that are unique to the CAISO market, such as flexible ramping product, our real-time markets multi-interval optimization, Western EIM transfers, greenhouse gas, et cetera, et cetera. And several stakeholders expressed concern about the potential for unintended consequences given these unique characteristics of our market compared to others, that if we implement fast start pricing without sufficient consideration of those impacts, that there may be unintended consequences. And that segues nicely into the next upcoming slides about what we will do in terms of fast start pricing within the working groups. So I'll pause there to see if there's any feedback or questions about this overview of phase one fast start pricing.
I don't see any questions in queue.
Okay, I'll just acknowledge a comment that came in while I was speaking that it would be helpful for, if you want to make have a chat question or a chat feedback, to address, if there are general questions or comments, to address everyone in the WebEx so that everyone can see the comments or questions. That would be helpful. If for some reason you do have a question for a specific panelist or for the panelists just in general that you don't want us to read out loud, feel free to just address it to the panelists in WebEx. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so now that we've gotten the overview of the 3 topics underway, we're gonna shift gears now to talking more nuts and bolts of the upcoming phase 2, the timeline, the stakeholder process, as Juan already highlighted, and also the scope. And this is where we're really hoping to get the most feedback from stakeholders, is on these 3 items: timeline, stakeholder process, and scope. So this is the phase 2 part. There's a figure in the discussion paper where this comes from. And this is only looking at phase 2. And as I explained to Dan, there's quite a spread of how far in advance we're planning to take these items to the board. And let's talk about this a little bit one by one. So we'll start with the left-hand side, which is scarcity pricing and BA level market power mitigation. Our plan is to commence pretty immediate proposal development and iteration for scarcity pricing and BA level market power mitigation. And tentatively, our first meeting we're planning for October 23rd. And as I mentioned to Dan earlier, we're hoping to provide within the next couple of days a more detailed schedule for what topics specifically we plan to tackle at each meeting so that stakeholders can come as prepared as possible and hopefully even provide some presentations to the working groups, which we more than encourage. So October 23rd is tentatively the first meeting. Our plan as of right now is to hold these meetings for scarcity pricing and BA level market power roughly bi-weekly, with a little break over Thanksgiving and Christmas, New Year holidays, in which case we think we can target a straw proposal for BA level market power and scarcity pricing by May 2025. And then from there, this figure shows a target draft final proposal in August 2026, which is roughly 3 months before this November 2026 board meeting. Now, as I mentioned, it's hard to anticipate exactly how long this proposal development will take place. We want to give the working group sufficient time to make sure that the policies that come out of this process are agreeable and work well and are well considered. But at the same time, we don't want to drag on forever. Some of these market issues can be seen as urgent and very helpful, and we want to implement these. And so there will be a competing sort of pressure and hopefully a good balance between moving things along at a good pace, while at the same time making sure there's sufficient time for that discussion. And so from that perspective, we're estimating maybe 15 months of work between the first draft proposal and the draft final proposal. That can be a lot quicker if things move smoothly, but we'll see. Now, on the right-hand side for fast start pricing, we're moving into more of the policy development side of fast start pricing and transitioning away from the analysis stuff. But we're going to be conducting working groups on fast start pricing in a parallel but concurrent process with scarcity pricing and BA level market power. The only difference is that the conclusion of these upcoming working groups are not expected to culminate in a straw proposal by the end of the working groups. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned in the fast start pricing discussion earlier, that there are sort of recognition of two things. One is that, as I mentioned, there are a lot of complicated market interactions with features that are unique to the CAISO that we're going to want to explore with stakeholders in detail. And in doing so, we'll better identify at the end a workable solution to fast start pricing by considering those things. Second, it was the general sentiment of the working groups through the comments that they wanted to continue with the pacing and the timeline that we had originally planned for in phase 1, where we started with this fast start pricing analysis and worked into some of this policy development in phase 2, and to be working on scarcity pricing and BA level market power issues more urgently. So what that means for these working groups in green is that they're going to be happening concurrently, but we're planning a little bit slower of a cadence, roughly around every month. And we'll have several working group meetings to get us through. We think we have a couple of good topics lined up for those working group meetings, but in the stakeholder comments, we'll be looking forward to hearing what your feedback is on what are the most important elements we should be discussing in those fast start pricing working groups. Then finally, for fast start pricing, there is a discussion paper and stakeholder recommendation milestone that's written for October 2025. That was part of the discussion paper for this one. So it basically looked like the same thing, the same type of paper that was published in early September that we're talking about today, the same type of stakeholder meeting as we're having now to discuss what went down in those working groups. So we are planning to maybe or perhaps have some earlier versions of that discussion paper a little earlier, depending on how much progress we're making and the pace we're going, to give stakeholders maybe an earlier sense of the direction things are moving instead of waiting all the way to October. So if I could, operator, can you please move to the next slide, and if it's timeline related, I'll move on. If not, I'll pause here for questions. Okay, so it's not. So let's pause at page 22, the previous slide. And if there's any feedback or questions about the timeline, now is a good time to bring that up.
Hey, James, this is Brenda. We activated the chat window where everyone could submit questions through chat to everyone. And also, per James' comment, if you do want to submit a question to panelists only, we can also review those through the panelist only line. Thank you. If you can go to number 22 per James' comment. I don't see any questions at this time, but we'll keep monitoring them as we move forward.
Okay, let's move to slide 23. We're going to transition now from timeline now more towards scope. So let's go to slide 23, please. So I apologize for the wordy slides, and I tried to cut them down as much as possible, but these are, there are more detailed versions of these tables in the discussion paper. And I tried to keep as few words as possible on here while still being able to sufficiently talk about these things. So first I want to talk about, before I talk about the scope, I wanted to explain the reason behind having these progress, complexity, and stakeholder priority and urgency columns here. And this was to give an albeit rough rating towards what the working group discussed as progress, complexity, and urgency of all of these potential scope items to help provide justification for why we're moving on with certain items faster than others. And BA level market power mitigation is a good example of that, because as you can see in the first row, where consideration of how to define the groups for the grouping approach for BA market power and sequence the assessments actually was the highest rated in terms of progress of all the scope items discussed. mostly because the concept and the algorithm was discussed in the working group, whereas for some of the other items that are proposed here for the scope have much lower level of progress. And so that was a factor in determining, how we would move forward into phase 2, especially for BA level market power. Complexity, they're all pretty, all of these are pretty complicated. So take these with a grain of salt. But the reason for having a rough rating of complexity is to show that, to justify that these efforts are going to take time, not just because they're complicated, as indicated by these ratings, but also because if they're complicated for policy reasons, they're also necessarily probably going to be complicated for implementation reasons. And for those reasons, it's right to expect perhaps a little slower progress to make sure that we get those things right. And of course, and finally, stakeholder priority and urgency was a factor in helping us determine among these topics how to prioritize them. So I don't think that it's worth for me to go word by word through all of these rows, but I can give you a high level of what each row means. The top row is related to the grouping approach, basically more examples, more walkthroughs, better definitions, and analysis. At the end of the day, stakeholders want to see analysis of when we come up with some sort of agreeable grouping approach, how might that impact the frequency of mitigation compared to the status quo to ensure that if the proposed method does not have much of a difference in mitigation, then perhaps it's not worth pursuing and adjustments should be made. Second, there are potential modifications to the BA mitigation approach, such as considering mitigating only pivotal suppliers rather than all suppliers in the BA level test. And in the third row, to consider an extra step of an impact test to only mitigate offers with LMP impacts defined above a defined threshold, as I mentioned in some previous slides. And then finally, in the last row, to determine if the CAISO BA should be included in the BA level market power test and treated like any other BA, and to provide data analysis on the competitiveness of the CAISO BA to justify this choice. So in the stakeholder comment template, we'll be asking stakeholders to assess, make sure that this scope aligns with their expectations coming out of the working groups. And if there are anything that we should consider in addition to this scope, that is feedback that we will take to this. So let's go to the next slide, which should be scarcity pricing. Again, sorry for the wordy slides, but I'll try to break down the four rows here as quickly as I can. The top slide is all about ancillary service procurement as it relates specifically to the CAISO balancing area and its scarcity reserve demand curve, and improvements that we might be able to make in ancillary service procurement to better unlock the potential for the scarcity reserve demand curve to be setting scarcity prices in the CAISO. And we recognize that, as you see in that last phrase there, that because the CAISO BA is in the foreseeable future the only balancing area in the WEAM and EDAM that has the market procure its AS, that other balancing areas will lack this feature, and it could create asymmetries in pricing. And we recognize that. And so we'll be looking to explore, are there mechanisms for the WEAM areas outside of the CAISO that don't procure AS through the market to be able to achieve some similar pricing outcomes so we can have consistency, and of course, whether that's desirable. Second, this row is all about the idea that prices should gradually rise as the risk of shortage increases to avoid shortages in the first place and avoid the spikiness that can happen when penalty prices are setting price very quickly. So there are a number of different possibilities of how we could accomplish this, as are written on the slide. I won't get into detail of each of these, but we will be thoroughly evaluating these different ideas and trying to come up with the best solution for doing this. Third is to review and consider updates to key pricing run penalty prices. And really, it's not all the penalty prices that need to be reevaluated. It's really about how do we scale and anchor penalty. Well, first, what value do we anchor our penalty prices to, and how do we scale them based off that value? So penalty prices are very complicated to make sure that, and finely tuned to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences. But the basic idea is that, is there something better than our bid cap to be anchoring our penalty prices to and scaling them off of? For example, there's discussion and comments about considering a value of lost load approach to scaling our penalty prices. And so we're going to be talking more about that in the scope of phase 2 for scarcity pricing. Finally, there's a lot of discussion in the working groups about pricing impacts of emergency or out-of-market actions that happen during scarcity events. There are some examples on the bullet there. But basically that there can be out-of-market or operator actions that either work to suppress the real-time market price relative to the grid situation, or perhaps increase the real-time market price relative to the grid situation. And we want to, as best as possible, make sure that our market prices are well aligned with the current conditions of the grid, and that gives market participants the best information and incentives that they need to behave in such a way and offer in such a way that mitigates or does its best to mitigate those emergency situations. Finally, let's go to slide 25 on fast start pricing. Fast start pricing the working group will basically be looking at fast start pricing from a number of different angles. So we'll have more discussion about how to qualify a resource for fast start resource based on startup time, minimum uptimes, as we identified that as the primary differentiator in impact. Second, to further our discussion about selection of an amortization methodology. And then once we have more information about what might be preferable from those two angles, we can consider how those things interact with our market features. Here's a long list of them. There might be more. If stakeholders have other things within the CAISO market that are unique that they would like the working group to explore, we'll be asking stakeholders to comment on that in response to this meeting. Or if there are things that are listed here that don't seem necessary to discuss, we'll be interested in that too. And all the while, we'll be considering feasibility of some areas of analysis to support policy development. The analysis phase has concluded as of phase 2, but if there is the need for reevaluating certain analyses or looking at uplift generally or more closely in the future, the working group can elevate that as an issue to explore in the near future. So I believe that is the last slide on scope for BA market power, scarcity pricing, and fast start pricing as it relates to the upcoming working groups. So I'll pause here to see if there's any feedback or any questions on this proposed scope.
Let's go ahead and get Alva unmuted. Ahmed, thank you.
James. Thank you, Brenda. Hello, James. I just wanted to have some level of participation. I think your discussion has been so excellent that it almost makes it difficult to voice a lot of concern. I think you incorporated a lot of what has been discussed in the previous workshops extremely well. Just a couple of thoughts on the last, on fast start pricing. I was curious as to what, or just potential other topics that I've heard sort of peripherally, but I don't know whether they really would be applicable, but they might also point towards the future more. One is whether there's any, what the effects on storage, either storage participating in fast start pricing or the effects of storage on fast start pricing because of the multi-hour and state of charge elements there. And the other, which is somewhat slightly related to that, is whether this initiative could also look at the question of whether there needs to be some, essentially when you do fast start pricing over multiple intervals, you're doing a binding settlement for future intervals for certain resources. Is it possible that there needs to be some consideration of having a more of a binding financial settlement over multiple intervals? And I'm not necessarily saying go to a multi-hour optimization, but maybe looking at the question of whether whatever is done in real time should have some financially binding aspects for the entire solution horizon in order to put all resources on an equivalent playing field, and if this becomes something that's activated. Just a couple of thoughts.
Those are both great thoughts, and ideally we would have had both of those listed here under interactions with market features, and they are omitted here, but I think that the CAISO team and the working group generally, I think, recognizes the value of both of those. On storage, I think you can kind of lump that in with multi-interval optimization generally, and maybe within that umbrella, we can look at, are there any unique impacts to storage because of that? And then I am aware that other markets have explored not multi-hour optimization, but when explored sort of settling all look-ahead intervals
Right.
in a multi-interval process. PJM comes to the top of my mind as having done that study. Of course, their market is single interval dispatch right now, but they did a detailed study about pros and cons of sort of multi-interval settlement under a multi-interval optimization. And perhaps we can sort of weave in some of those concepts here to see if there's anything, worth taking from that.
That sounds great. Thank you, James. Again, this is really good summaries of all three topics here. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Are there any other questions or feedback on the scope of these three topics?
Hi, James. This is Sybil from PGP. Really appreciate the summary today. I think this was a great recap of everything that we've covered so far in the working group. I was curious, and it's okay if you don't know the answer to this, but sort of how you are going to use these progress, complexity, and urgency to sort of sequence the policy development going forward. I found these to be helpful to capture sort of what was covered and what needs more analysis, et cetera. And also the prioritization I thought was very, representative of the stakeholder feedback. But I could see how, there could be different ways to approach this where, like, if you have a high level of progress and strong urgency, that you just sort of see that as low-hanging fruit and tackle it first, or are there other ways that you've thought about how to incorporate this into the sequencing? Thanks.
Great question. So we did put again, these are a rough estimate, okay? So they're not, take all of these numbers with a grain of salt, of course. And they can change over time too. And we want to make sure that's clear, that this is a snapshot in time as of the last feedback that we received. However, we did try to put these numbers together because we think that it helps to justify sort of two things. And both of them, I think you already mentioned. One is that there is a feeling that the level of progress that's been made on BA level market power mitigation specifically warrants potentially an earlier look at that in terms of policy development, as you mentioned, because there's sort of less runway to get through, and maybe that's something that we can tackle fairly quickly. Now, it's being proposed to be lumped in with scarcity pricing, which there is much less progress on scarcity pricing. And so there will have to be a balance between making sure we're not, we're making progress on both items, but at the same time, if it seems to look like we're accomplishing a great deal on BA level market power and it stands to reason maybe to separate that out, then of course we will take that direction, when the time applies. So there's a lot of different variations of the ways these things can go based on the feedback and the progress we make. But then also the second thing in terms of complexity. So the fast start pricing design specifically in terms of complexity, and this 5 here tries to justify that we are trying to incorporate a pricing mechanism that we don't have any features. Well, we have very limited features. We have the COG model that's not really used, but we don't have this existing feature in our market, and there are a lot of potential interactions, and that's why the complexity for this one is rated pretty high, actually the highest rating that we had, because we hope that it justifies the fact of moving a little bit slower on fast start pricing in terms of when we might reach a straw proposal, because there seemed to be recognition that there are all these potential impacts that we want to make sure are well considered before moving into a formal straw proposal of those things. So I guess to summarize, a combination of progress, urgency, and complexity did help us formulate the scope and timeline of the phase 2 efforts, and we tried to make those ratings more explicit to give some justification for why we made those choices. Now, again, things can change as we move forward, and priorities can change, and things that were complicated may become uncomplicated, or vice versa. You know what I mean. So hopefully you understand that this is a very flexible process and just a snapshot in time at this present moment.
Great, thanks.
Okay, let's go ahead and mute Stuart Kelly. Please be sure to introduce your organization.
James, thanks for that. What you laid out in terms of timing makes a lot of sense, because I do believe the market power mitigation can move quickly, but if scarcity pricing can move in the same timeline, great. And it does make a lot of sense to me with fast start pricing on a far slower timeline because of the complexity. And you did mention PGM, and I'm glad you did. And it would be good to look at the lessons learned there from the market monitor, and in any policy that's put together, or draft policy, make sure that it addresses all the issues that PGM have identified. I understand there's slightly different constructs in those markets, but it would be great if we draw from lessons learned in PGM in particular, where they've outlined some issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, so we are tentatively planning for some guest speakers at these fast start pricing workshops, and PGM, of course, being one of them. And so we're working on that. It can be difficult sometimes to translate perfectly the lessons learned that are going on in one market to other markets, because all the markets are so unique. However, having said that, it is nice to hear from others about their experience, and if there are any traps that we should avoid, we can make sure to do that. So yes, we are planning to incorporate more outside support from potential other markets and market designers from those markets that have knowledge about fast start pricing practices in their markets. So I think that will be good and helpful as you described. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I appreciate that, and that's good news. Thank you.
I don't see any more questions in queue. Unless anyone has any questions, just raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Should we move to the next slide? All right, well, I'm regretting a little bit that this came up in 26 after 25 slides, because this actually was sort of the primary accomplishment of the phase 1 PFE working group. So kudos to stakeholders and staff that worked on this quick implementation of methods to bid above the soft updates to bidding above the soft offer cap. So as most of you should know, FERC approved the tariff revisions in July 31st, and the policy was implemented on August 1st. As of the MPPF, which is the Market Planning and Performance Forum that was held a week or two ago, indications seem to be that this functionality is working as intended. And so that's good news. And it's any features or any bugs are being continuously monitored in case that were not to happen in the future. Now, there is ongoing continuation of some of the discussion that we had related to bidding above the soft offer cap going on in other venues that are not price formation. First is there are discussions around storage default energy bid enhancements happening in the storage BCR and DEB enhancements initiative that's already underway and has proposals out there. And I believe the DEB discussions are on a little slower track than the BCR, but those should be coming down the pipe. Second, there have been stakeholder discussions about the maximum import bid price shaping factor that have occurred within its own, it's not really an initiative, but its own sort of section. And there have been updates to, or at least proposals to, the way the maximum import bid price calculation and its shaping factor are done. And so those are good. Now for future, there are still some future considerations that came out of this process that we're still considering. First is to explore opportunity costs for hybrid resources and PDRs, proxy demand response resources, and also to explore potential changes to storage bid cap in the day-ahead market. Those future considerations don't have a home yet, but the ISO is exploring, sort of whether and how to tackle those two items for future reference. So again, a big congratulations for the phase 1 working group of elevating this issue. Many of those 18 working group meetings that we did were to discuss this item. And it is hopefully good proof of our ability to sort of nimbly collaborate together between the ISO and stakeholders to solve urgent issues. Any questions or feedback on this slide? Okay, should we move to the next slide? This is the last slide of the presentation today. Just quickly to discuss the next steps and stakeholder feedback. Stakeholder comments will be tentatively due October 14th, which is 2 weeks from today. And the stakeholder comment template will ask you to comment mostly on the scope, timeline, and stakeholder process identified in today's discussion. So here in these green boxes are a couple of the elements that we're hoping to get feedback from stakeholders on. And this feedback will be considered as we move towards our first, hopefully our first working group meeting on scarcity pricing and MPN on October 23rd, which is a Wednesday, roughly 3.5 weeks from today. And I will acknowledge a comment in the chat, and I've heard from others that I think our website currently says that stakeholder comments are due on Friday, October 4th, which is an old date or a typo, I'm not sure. But the updated date is Monday, October 14th. Sorry for the confusion. Brenda or Juan, is there anything you'd like to add about stakeholder feedback?
This is Brenda. So I went ahead and make sure that date will reflect as October 14th. We did previously noticed on a few weeks ago when we posted the paper that we were posting the paper with the comment deadline October 4th, but we'll make sure that our stakeholders have enough time. And then we did have that comment template updated and posted now, so that date will be reflected, and also those questions are available for your organization to review and provide comments before that date. I did send that link out on the chat for those who are able to access it right away. And if we do update this presentation, we'll go ahead and do that after this call.
So with that, this slide ends my portion of the presentation. I'll pause one more time if there's any last minute feedback or questions.
I don't see any questions, but if anyone has any question, like, feel free to raise your hand. I do see a lot of folks have their audio connected still, so if you do have questions, raise your hand or submit it through chat. But I think for the most part, everyone seems to have no questions. I don't see anyone raising their hand.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody, and we will look forward to starting again on phase 2 coming up soon. And like I mentioned, we're going to try to have a more detailed schedule as it relates to which topics will be discussed on what dates. You have to give us a little flexibility on the dates because, you know, things come up, board meetings, other things come up where the dates might not be perfect so far in advance, but hopefully it gives at least a good sense of the cadence and what topics are planned to be discussed. And if you have comments about things that you would like to see discussed in these working groups, that would be welcome in your written comments. Thanks everybody. I'll pass it to you, Brenda, to close this out.
Thank you, James. We appreciate your presentation. It was really a great learning experience for most of us who were able to follow your lead on the slides. So as for the next slide, if you may, Ahmed, if you could pass me a presentation right now. We would just kind of cover the last few slides on the next steps, as previously mentioned with James. If you have any questions, feel free to send him an email. His email is here. If you do have any other questions, we could also send them over to the ISO stakeholder affairs at kaiso.com. We did update the presentation this morning, and as well the comment template. That date will be reflected on October 14th. If you do experience any technical issues with your commenting account, let us know. We'll make sure everything is set. We did get a few questions on that. The next update we have is that the new policy initiatives timeline that the ISO Stakeholder Affairs team has been working on is posted weekly. I do encourage for those who are following us on multiple initiatives to review that document. It kind of gives a highlight overview of all of those initiatives on where they're at and what status of them within the proposal development phase. So it'll be kind of great to see it. And we planning to add more items on there to make it more easy for those who are following us on those initiatives. And then next, we do have the energy blog matters that we have been posting the past few months. We just had one posted a few minutes ago, and a new one that was just posted a few minutes ago is just about artificial intelligence as its role for the modernization and potential risk. Indu is also featured in that energy blog, so feel free to visit that to get more information on the up-to-date blogs that we're posting. But yeah, they're all relevant to the energy industry and any other items within initiatives as well. And lastly, we do have an ISO Stakeholder 2024 Stakeholder Symposium coming up the end of this month, next month, October 29th and 30th. We're definitely looking forward to a lot of participation for this upcoming year. So if you have any questions, we do have that link and registration is still available, and we do have space available for those who have been emailing us on that questions, but feel free to double check on your registration, make sure you have a confirmation. During the Stakeholder Symposium, you will be asked to provide your first and last name at the registration booth, so you don't have to provide any QR codes or emails. So that way we can ensure that everyone's registered and going into the welcome reception if you did register to attend that. And if you didn't, make sure to let us know if you are planning to attend so we can update your registration form. But at this point, I don't see any more questions, and we'll definitely wrap this call. We look forward for your comments. They're due October 14th for price formation enhancements, and we look forward to other individuals on the initiatives that we're following. I'll pass it back to Ahmed to close our call. Thank you.
This event has concluded. Thank you for using Teller services. You may now disconnect.